Thank you for joining us. As usual, we'll wait just a minute or so to let anyone who's attending the Zoom meeting join in, and then we'll get started. All right, I now call this school board workshop for South Woody School District number 206 to order. Our first order of business is our land acknowledgement. I turn to Director Jackson for that.
Thank you. South Woodbury School District has a written land acknowledgement, which can be viewed on our website, also mounted on the wall here in this boardroom. I'd like to acknowledge the first peoples of this island, the Snohomish people, for whom this is an ancestral and present-day home, the peoples for whom care of and stewardship of this place is an ancestral tradition, including the Stillaguamish, Suquamish, Snohomish, Swinomish tribes, the peoples collectively associated with the Tulalip tribes, and the peoples of the Lower Skagit tribes and the Lushootseed language family. A land acknowledgement is not a static written document. It is not something that is published and then set aside. It is a statement of intention to be in relationship, acknowledgement of that relationship with people, with place, and with the history and future of that place and these people. And so for me, sharing a land acknowledgement invokes a feeling of responsibility to steward my own relationships in community with people, with human and other than human life, and with the stories that thread through this community that we share and this island that we live upon and steward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As this is a board workshop, we'll have open public comment and discussion during the on the items on the agenda. If you're in person, please just raise a hand so we can get you a mic, so those who are online or watching the video later can hear you. If you're on the Zoom, we have a couple of folks on the Zoom, and you have something you'd like to say, please just note your name and location in the Q&A. I'll see it popping up, and then you can start typing. Please don't just say, I agree with what this person said, because we may be a couple of comments beyond that. So please just note a full thought on what you're looking at. All right, we will move on to our first note, which is a presentation, our first presentation on the 2024-2025 budget. Mr. Pullman.
So we are looking at the budget for the 24-25 school year, which starts September 1st of 2024 and will go through August 31st of 2025. We'll have an adoption in July for that, and several opportunities between now and then to have conversations about different parts of the budget. It's a work in process, so it will change. You'll see different numbers as we refine and reassess what we're doing with things. Not until it is officially adopted by the school board will become a fixed document, so that we will see changes as we go through this. We're going to talk predominantly about general fund. We'll talk about the other funds later in the season. The one fund that we'll talk about probably more than we've ever had before is Capital Projects Fund, because that's where all the funding for the bond projects will go into. So it'll be substantially larger than it's ever been before, and there'll be those processes. So in developing a budget for a general fund, there's really 5 major components to this thing that we're going to talk about. And tonight we'll talk about enrollment and revenue, and then we'll come back and talk about staffing, and then finally the expenditure aspect of it. But enrollment is critical, student enrollment in this process, because we're in a state that generates revenue based on the number of students that you have in a school district. And it's based on the student FTE, which is the full-time equivalent. So if you're at the high school, you go 4 periods, you're a full-time student. If you go 2, you're a 0.5. So it's a funding model. But the importance of the enrollment, other than that kids are important, is that it's the basis for the protocol school funding model, which creates revenue for school districts. It also creates the need for staffing, how many teachers we need in classroom based on class sizes, et cetera, and the other things that are in the collective bargaining agreements. There's a variety of different parameters around there that will help us with the staffing piece. And then most of our expenditures in a school district is payroll, about 87%, which is defined by that staffing component, and then the supplies and other services. And finally, the last thing is fund balance. And think of that as your savings account. It's money you have for cash flow purposes, for emergencies. If we somehow overestimated our enrollment and it was less than we thought, we would need funds to cover those type of things. And I'd love it to be a conversation. So if people have comments, questions, clarifications along the way, please ask. The first thing we are required by statute is to have a balanced budget. And that basically means that our expenditures are going to be less than or equal to our beginning fund balance, our revenues, and then a remaining fund balance at the end of the year. So we can have more expenditures than we have revenue as long as we have more fund balance than we need. And we'll talk about that later. The other thing is we do a fund balance policy in the school board area. And it basically that we will budget a fund balance. It isn't that we will maintain it throughout the year, but we will budget a 1/12, basically 1 month expenditures. And it's about 8.33% of our budget expenditures. So it's a process we do during the budget process that hopefully carries us through the year. Public input, another statute that requires a minimum public input, which is basically that hearing in July. We'll have many more opportunities than that. I expect to have several of these throughout the spring. And then we will have an opportunity on July 10th. There is a mandated date that I have to have a budget, not I, that Paul will have to have a budget available for. And there'll be a presentation on that evening that will talk about the 24-25 budget, the 4-year projection, and probably a budget extension for capital projects if we don't do it prior to that. Because of the bond work, we're going to spend more money in capital projects this year than we had planned. So we will have to do a budget extension prior to that. On the 24th, there'll be a budget hearing. Again, another opportunity for community to give input on the budget. Though hopefully on July 10th is when most of that input would happen, when it's more of a workshop format and a better opportunity to have a dialogue. If the budget is adopted on the 24th, we then send it to OSPI and has to be there by the 1st of August. So we are a second-class district, so we are a month earlier than the larger districts in the state. So process-wise, that's kind of the timeline we're working on, but I expect to probably have a couple more of these between now and July 10th, where we talk about staffing and then expenditures.
A quick question.
Yes.
For individuals unable to make either of those two events, are there ways to give input onto the budget, the email?
Yes, they can certainly email superintendent, myself, school board. They can come in and I'd be happy to talk to people about budget or anything else. So yes, there's a lot of different ways that people can have input other than just coming to a meeting.
Thank you.
So when we're looking at our budget, what's the kind of the heavy emphasis is causing stress on budgets? For us, enrollment loss is one of those. As we'll show you a little later, we are about 25 years into that process. So it's not new, but it's something that is detrimental. For our district, the state protocol funding model is very problematic, and we'll look at why it's like that. And it's causing problems in other places, but we're kind of aggravated based on what happened. We'll talk about inflation a little bit and what that is, and then about underfunded and unfunded programs and the effect it has on the budget. Again, student enrollment drives state funding. If that's one thing you walk away understanding, is that the number of kids you have drives how much money you're going to receive. So if you're a full-time student in this district and you're in the ALE program, the state will give the district about $10,038 for each student. The basic education, it's 11,263 for the coming year. Special education is 11,028 plus the basic education amount. We get both of those. And then the MSOC, the money for supplies, service, utilities, insurance is about $1,533 per pupil. So it's just a straight allocation. So enrollment loss, how's that affected? Well, since we are funded on the number of students we have, if we have 30 fewer students next year, which is about what we're thinking, that's about $383,000. If you think about that, 30 students, say that's a classroom, a little more than a classroom, but it's a classroom. Well, the loss is about twice what the cost would be to staff that classroom with staff. So it isn't just an equal amount. We have fewer kids and the amount we receive offsets that amount. It's actually greater than that. We start looking at enrollment. One of the things we look at is enrollment history, and it gives us an idea where we're going in the future by looking at the past. And this is kind of 10-year increments starting in 1983. And you can see in the, between 85 and 95, we were a growing district. Slowed down in 1995, and I'll show you in a minute something that I think is critical that they didn't pay attention to at that time. And then between about 2003 and 2013, we had a huge drop in enrollment at that time. And then it's continued to go down. So that's kind of the pattern we're looking at. And we're estimating about 1105 for the current year is where we are. And you can see that in, 92, 93, we're over 2,000 at that time. In 2003, we're at 2139, almost twice as many students as we have today. So it's that pattern that we've seen. It's not new. We're actually looking at almost a 30-year pattern when we look at this. Another way of looking at enrollment, and this one I think is important because it gives you more information. You look at numbers, you can see, okay, the district has more kids this year than last year. But if you look in the 80s, you can see between 85 and 95, there is substantial growth, 5.5, 7.9, big numbers each year. That was growth on top of where you were the year before. And then they hit about 1995, and this is what I think people didn't pay attention to and what caused our problem in 2004, is all of a sudden that growth dropped to 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, almost non-existent. It was flat, and they were still ramping things up during that time frame. And that's why when we hit 2004, all of a sudden we had a financial problem, is I don't think people paid attention to that change that happened. They still had more kids, but it's like 6, 8 more kids a year is all. It wasn't a huge number change. And then since the year 2000, you can see that it's been fewer kids every year. Some years dramatically less. 2010 was that year that's 9.2%. It was a dramatic year. But it starts looking at that pattern of what does our enrollment look like? And you can see that really it started in 1995. It didn't start in 2000, didn't start in 2010. It's been a pattern that has been there for a really long time if you start to analyze the changes from year to year. So we start looking at enrollment for next year by looking at enrollment for this year. We had budgeted 1106 for our K-12 program, and that's our basic education. When I talk about basic education, I'm talking about your traditional classrooms and our ALE program combined. We didn't budget for transitional kindergarten because we didn't know we were going to do that. We had an ECAP program at this time last year. But we're at about 1105, so we're about one below where we thought we'd be for the year. But what I look at is how does this year compare to last year and previous years when we start looking at forecasting what enrollment looks like. And there are several ways we can do that. We can just roll everybody over. If you have 100 kids in first grade, we would assume there'd be 100 kids in second grade. We know that doesn't work from past experience. You can do a straight cohort survival. You had 100 kids in first grade last year, you have 90 this year. In second grade, it's a 0.9, and you can extrapolate from that. Or we can do multi-year. We can do weighted things where you weight it more based on what's happened currently versus previous. There's a lot of different models you can do. But what I found over time is they're really not that different in the numbers they have. So if we rolled what we have today over, we'd be at about 1,090. If we do a 1 year straight, this is what happened in 23, 24, we'd be about 1,078. A 3-year weighted model is about 1,093, and a 5-year average is about 1,080. So not a huge difference. You're maybe 13 students in the whole district different. My suggestion is because of the financial constraints, we look at that 1 year straight. What happened this year is what we would extrapolate for next year. It's also the most conservative, which I've always pushed for that because we staff based upon enrollment numbers. And once we have staff in place after May 15th who are certificated, they have a contract for the following year, whether we have that many students or not. So that would be my suggestion. And if we did that, that would put about 1,012 kids in our basic education program, about 61 or so in our alternative program that's located on campus, and another 5 through Spokane Virtual Academy.
So in the past, you've suggested that rolling the weighted average, if I'm hearing you correctly, the main reason you're suggesting the 1 year straight here is it's more conservative and gives us more leeway in case of a lower enrollment number.
It's easier to add
Yes.
than it is to have
Yes.
not enough funding.
I'm just trying to make sure that I understand why you're suggesting a different route this year than in previous years. And
Under
it
promise,
totally
over
ma-
deliver.
And it totally makes
Okay.
sense.
And the difference, if we want to, is 10 students and $110,000. So it's not a huge dollar amount one way or the other, but it's easier to add a couple kids in a classroom than it is to try to figure out, how we're going to solve a $110,000 shortfall or something like that.
As Dr. Moshe said, to put it a geeky way, the Scotty principle.
Yeah.
I'll have it fixed in 10 hours, Captain. 3 hours later, it's done.
So where's really the change? Well, the change is in this building. If you look at it, about 30 FTE difference in here. And the easiest way to understand that is we look at the fifth grade this year. This is the April number. There's 90 students in the fifth grade in this building who will move and go to a different building next year. We're projecting about 60 to replace them. There's about a 30 difference in there. And there's some variations on the grade levels as far as, they go up and down. We get more kids in, some grades and we lose some in others. But that's the simplest explanation for those 30 kids is we just have fewer kids coming into the system than we have going out. The 60.5 is a average of the last 3 years. So that's how I come up with that. I did look at the, 2020 census. I looked at some 22 information from OFM, Department of Financial Management, and it doesn't look like the numbers are growing in that 0 to 5 group for South Whidbey. The numbers are really growing on the other end of the scale, but it doesn't look like there's more than maybe 4 or 5 kids more than there was, a few years ago. So I don't see a big change in that kindergarten enrollment number. So it gives us the idea of where we have to, look at staffing, because we staff by grade level, by classroom. So it's like, okay, if there's changes in this building, how does that affect? And there's changes between, you look at the 4th and 5th grade, they are different than the current year. So there will be some changes for our principal to think about what is the structure of her program in the classes that she will need. So these are for funding calculations. So basic ed, we're going to look at about 1,012 FTE, the TK program 14, the alternative learning program about 66.5, special education at 180, the vocational program at the high school about 60 kids, bilingual with 7, and then Running Start, we have to budget for it, though it has no district funding. It's a flow through to community colleges, but we have roughly 35 kids that do that. So when we talk about funding, we need to talk about the prototypical school funding model. And we'll talk about the McCleary decision because it changed how schools are funded and it dramatically changed how we're funded. We'll touch on it later, but if you look at the left side, it says regionalization and experience. That's enhanced funding that districts get or may not get depending on who you are. And you can see that in 1920, we received 24% more in regionalization. Today, we're down to 18%. So it's a regressive funding model for us. And the same thing happened to the experience factor, which was the experience because of our certificated staff being experienced. Now that has gone down. So it has created this stagnant basis in our funding model. The other thing I want to slightly talk about is the state levy swap that happened with McCleary, because that affects us also. It puts a limit on what we can and cannot do as a community. So the prototypical school funding model, it's basically a staffing allocation. So I want people to understand it's not about how many people we staff or how much we pay people. It's just a way that they figure out how much money they are going to give you, and then you figure out what to do with it. Legislative session has an effect on that model every year. So we know that there is an inflationary adjustment, IPD, implicit price deflator of 3.7%, which from OSBI standpoint means that they will increase the salary allocation that they give us by 3.7%. The health insurance cost also went up by $936 per person per year. So it's $1,178 per month per person. Again, it has an effect on us because they don't fund everybody. So if there's an increase in these things, we're picking that up locally. The MSOC rate, material supplies and other costs, went up by 1.9%. You'll see, we'll talk about other costs that went up much higher than that. So while they tell us inflation is 3.7%, there is no legislative reason that ties the increase in MSOCs to inflation. They pick a number, and of course, they pick about half of what inflation is. So it's a widening divide between the actual cost and inflation and what we're getting funding for. They did increase the special education cap from 15 to 16%. That's great if you're a district that was above 15% to start with. We're not one of those. We are at 15%. So in order to generate more revenue, we need more expenditures rather than changing the formula so that the difference that we're already being underfunded by was picked up. They did that. And then the experience factor, this was one positive thing. It was supposed to go away for us this year completely, or 24-25 completely. They decided to step it down over a 2-year period. So we lost 1% instead of the full 2%. So it's just a slowing of the same process. Staffing units. In the protocol school funding model, they talk about staffing units, and it's a way that they categorize staff. They have certificated staff. Think of that as your teacher, anybody with a certificate and an endorsement. Classified staff, which is almost everybody else in the district, whether it's bus drivers or food service or secretaries or paraeducators or district office, or you can go on and on. And then administrative staff, and this is certificated administrative staff, predominantly superintendent and building administration. So they have 3 categories that they fund differently and to create their formula. And what they use is what they refer to as this protocol school funding model. And this is, in my mind, a broken formula. On the far left is the model. So if you have a high school with 600 students, they will fund 1.88 principals. They will fund 1.2 teacher planning time. And you think about a 4-period day where a teacher has 1 planning period and 3 teaching periods. That's more than a 0.2, right? Number of teachers, classroom, et cetera. So they use this formula. But if you look at the right, you'll see what our high school actually has with 356 students in there. They only fund 1.12 principals, 16 classroom teachers, 1.75 counselors, a 0.4 nurse, much less than what is needed to run a building. And if you look at the classified staffing, it becomes even worse. So it doesn't fully fund most school district buildings. It's just this model they have that you have 600 kids, a building of this particular size, this is what you need in it. So it's not a very supporting model. Once you know how many staff they are going to fund, then they tie a dollar amount to those funding models. And each of those, the certificated instructional staff, the classified staff, and certificated administrative staff are all funded at a different rate. The average state allocation is what every district across the state receives. So they changed it from a model where they funded you based on your education experience of individual teachers to, we're just going to give you an average for your teachers. And then there's enhanced funding, the experience factor for certificated staff, which used to be 4%, going down to 1%, and regionalization that started at 24% has gone down to 18%. And you add those together, and that's the dollar amount that they are going to apply to every 1 FTE that they are going to fund. If we were to look at that funding level, you will realize that what we're being funded and what people are making is dramatically different. And so that's money that we pick up through our local levy. And you also notice that with the instructional staff, that even though there's a 3.7 IPD, because of the experience factor going down, we're really only being funded 2.8% more than we were in the previous year. And it's a pattern we've seen for the last 5 years. So it isn't that we're really getting the 3.7%, even though that kind of flows through into salaries and other things. So here's a longer term picture of it, and I think it gives a better picture. 1920, McCleary happened. All of a sudden, things popped up. We got 24% regionalization, 4% experience factor, and it started these calculations. Well, the next year, our regionalization went down by 22%, and that's for all staffing allocations across the district. So our certificated staffing allocation model increased by 0.01% in their funding, where the other two actually went down. We received less than we did the year before, even though there was 1.6% inflation. The following year, 2% inflation, again, a 2% drop, we got about a 0.4% increase as opposed to that 2% increase. Again, another drop. It was a 5.5% IPD that year, really large. It really worked out to about 3.8%. So not only are they not funding everybody, they're not fully funding the people they are funding in this scenario. This year, regionalization has settled at that 18%, but the experience factor dropped by 2%. So again, you see the increase to certificated instructional staff at only 2%, not 3.7. And again, in 24-25, we'll see something similar where it's less than IPD. So it's just creating this big divide between what our expenditures are for salaries and what we're actually being allocated for those same models.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the experience factor reduction has been for every district, but we're one of very few in the state that's had that regionalization number go down each year, correct?
Well, there's a little correct in each of those statements and a little not correct.
Right, because not
Okay,
every
so there
district
was-
got the
yeah,
experience factor.
There were 7 districts in the state that received 24% regionalization. There are some that received 12. There are some that received none. It's been a variety of things. So this was kind of the first, 5-year plan is this is what's going to happen. And then they readjusted it recently. And we stayed at 18%. There's some districts that went up and some that went down. So there are districts that lost more than they had before. The experience factor, evidently our teachers are less experienced than they were 5 years ago. So we received the 4% because we were above the state average in experience, and somehow that has changed. I haven't seen any documentation that tells us how that works, but it happens. So it's
But
it's what we
nobody's
are.
getting the experience factor. It's going away for everyone.
No, there are some districts that got an increase in experience factor.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's dropping for most, is it not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they calculated it. The one thing they had talked about, and I don't think it passed, but they had talked about tying it to your free and reduced population. Like, how does the experience of your staff and the amount you pay them have anything to do with whether your free and reduced is high or low? So they're not very thoughtful conversations that they're having. So anyway, so when we look at, why is our revenue not going up? Well, this is why it's not going up, is we were set up in this regressive funding model, knowing that we were going to come out and negotiate those dollars in 1920, and that would go away over time. So simply number of students times that staffing ratio equals the number of staff that are allocated times that dollar amount. You add the benefits, FICA, Medicare, retirement, healthcare, et cetera. And then the number of students times that MSOC amount of 1533, and that gives you your state apportionment. And they refer to it as a guaranteed state apportionment, but it's not really guaranteed until June. The other thing is the local levies, and this is one that hits us hard, is that because we live in a community that has a lot of high assessed property value, it's actually closing in on $8 billion at this time. Most districts are going to ask for a dollar rate, $1.50 per thousand. At that rate, we could be in the $12-15 million range for a levy. Because it is so high, we can only do a per pupil amount, and it's about $3,000 in the coming year times 1,100 kids gives us about that, the $3.5 million range. But if you look at that, prior to McCleary, the local school district, out of the total school tax bill, state and local, we were using about 17.2% locally in the community. Now we get about 10% of that. So a lot more of the local taxes are going to the state and being redistributed across the state rather than coming back to South Whitney. We don't get 100% of the state dollars coming back to us. So it has limited us on the amount that we can use, which levies are things that we use for our athletic programs, we use for negotiated items, for salary increases above the state allocate, all those things. Well, you'll see that in 2019, we were approved for $4.3 million from the community. Year before, we had collected about 4.2 million. We rolled back or did not collect from the community that year almost $1 million because we were limited to that per pupil amount. And that it has pretty much stayed at about that 3.5 range for the last 5 years and will not increase because the dollar amount is only increased by CPI as opposed to anything else. So when you have fewer kids, dollar amount isn't going to change that much that it's going to allow us to collect much more money. If we had stayed with the original model that we had in 2019, we'd be collecting about $4.5 million locally now instead of the 3.5, and that $1 million would solve the cash flow issue that we see. So between the change in the funding model at the state and the limitations to the per pupil levy collection, that has created, fundamental issues in this district as far as the fact that we cannot grow our revenue. Inflation is another one of those things that we have to look at. We look at our liability insurance. We've already been told by them that it's about a 15% increase. We're going to $400,000. And again, our funding increase to support that is 1.9%. So the cost of utilities, the cost of insurance, the cost of a variety of things is outstripping the amount that we're getting that increase.
And
yeah.
the district liability insurance, didn't that go up by 30% last year?
Not quite. They said it was going to, but it ended up being probably closer to, I think it was 18%.
Okay.
But yes, it's been huge jumps.
Yeah. Is there any rationale as to why?
Yes. Yes.
As a matter of fact, since I'm part of the executive board for the Washington Schools Risk Management Pool, we are a pool, so we are self-funded, and there's been a dramatic increase across the nation, actually, but certainly across the state in sexual molestation cases, as well as the collections on those cases. So, for example, cases used to yield $1 million or $2 million in damages could be 24 or 25 million now. And so because we are self-funded and because we go out for reinsurance, the cost of providing that liability insurance for all districts has gone up dramatically. And there really are only 2 options in the state, and we are in one of the 2. The other is clear risk. So districts across the state are experiencing it. There is a factor, if a district has more claims rather than less claims, they aren't assessed as big a hit, but this is the baseline.
And the other thing that, happens in school funding is the concept of underfunding or unfunded. And I'll use special education as an example because it's the poster child that you hear, across the state is that special education is underfunded. Last year, we spent about $500,000 more for those services, and the need for those services is dramatically increasing. It isn't that, we're not doing a good job. It's just that it's expensive. And the changes to the cap doesn't change the fact that we were spending $500,000 on 180 kids. The funding model doesn't adjust that. It didn't say, okay, we're gonna give you more per pupil, which will help offset that. It says we can give you more money if you have more kids. So it didn't really help, but it's just one of those underfunding, and there's a lot of underfunding. Transportation isn't fully funded in our district. Staffing levels, they don't fund all the staff we have, and we are probably about as lean as you can get in the state. I mean, we are we are rock bottom. They don't fund salaries at the full amount that people make. Employee benefits, here's an example, which I find interesting, but we are mandated to provide 12 days of paid sick leave to every employee in the district. We get funded for 4 certificated staff days per certificated staff member only. So they don't even fund all 12, they fund 4, but they don't fund anything for classified or administrators. So it's one of those mandates that we're required to do, but we get no money to do it.
And it's only on the prototypical model of the
Correct.
number of certificated staff.
Yeah, you can just keep building this if you want layers to it. And then utilities, insurance, again, those things are underfunded. And then there's things they don't fund at all. You know, the food service program isn't funded by the state. Take that back. They give us $2,500 a year towards food service. But our athletic program is, again, one of those local programs. Anything that we negotiate, extended days for staff, stipends, additional time, responsibility, personal days, vacation days, those are all things that are funded locally out of our levy, which isn't growing. But again, you know, fundamental parts of the school that just are not being in that model. So that gets us part when we start talking about revenue. Okay, so we understand how we get there. So what does it look like? Well, there's 5 main funding sources for the general fund. The first is our local property taxes, which is at 3.5 million. There's local district generated funds. That's money we generate at the building level, and we'll go through those. There's state apportionment, and then there's categorical funding. And when I say categorical funding, I mean if we get $300,000 through IDEA for special education, it has to be spent on special education only in a very specific way based upon the grant that we receive. And if we don't spend it in that way, then we do not receive the funds. It's a reimbursement model. And we get audited on that. That's one of the audits we have every year is our federal programs to make sure we are spending the money appropriately, we're collecting it appropriately, we're following all the federal and state regulations. State funding for categorical programs or like remediation, special education, a variety of different programs like that. Again, money we get for specific programs to be spent specifically in those programs. We have a little more leeway in state funding than we do in federal funding as far as the purpose, as long as it's in that main category of what is it that we're spending it on. The thing about state apportionment is that when we do this budget, we're using estimates. So we're estimating the number of kids we're going to have. We're estimating the funding we'll receive from that based on those estimates. And then we are incurring expenditures that get locked in that are solid. So we have salaries and benefits and all those things, you know, those are fixed at that point. OSBI pays districts from September through December based on those estimates. So if we estimate that we have 1,100 kids, they're going to pay us based on those 1,100 kids. When we get to January, if we have 1,000 kids, they're going to readjust that down and pay us less than we would have received on our estimated amount. If we have 1,200 kids, they're going to pay us more. So they call it truing up, but it's an adjustment that happens from January through June. And we actually know in June, 9 months into our fiscal year, what our guaranteed funding is actually going to be for the year. So it's a model that's a little risky because you start with what you believe is your best estimate and tie your expenditures to those estimates and then hope that, you know, everything works.
Which would be why you suggest the most conservative model
Yes.
each year. Yes.
So looking at revenue, first is our property taxes, about 3.5 million, not much of a change from the current year, slightly up from previous years. And it's adjusted by CPI sometimes, which is artificially adjusted at OSBI, which gives you a little bit of leeway in there. But again, based on students, so it isn't going to change much as long as our student population stays about the same. And then we get into the money that we generate in the district level. Building resales, you're in a shop class and you need wood for your project, the district buys it and then the student reimburses it, stuff like that. Food service, you'll see that that is expecting to take a drop this year. And that's because in this particular building, we will have free breakfast and lunch for every student that would like to participate next year. Yay, yay, yay. So that'll change our local sales and reimburses in federal dollars. So it'll be a little less here, but more when we look at our federal reimbursement. So that's a very exciting thing that we can provide for our community. So I'm happy with that. Investment income is just the the income we get from investing the money that we have in our fund balance. You know, it's been larger this year and last year. Interest rates have gone up. Expect they will probably drop down in the coming year some, and we also will have less fund balance as we spend it down. Grants, it's just a placeholder, school foundation, whoever else might be giving us grants. And then we have our rentals from Bayview and the community center that I expect to go up slightly. And then unassigned, we just get money sometimes it doesn't fit in any of these categories, and I have to put them in program 29, which is unassigned. So you'll see that it's very similar from year to year. The only difference is that local sales of food service is going to drop it down slightly. Then we go on to
I was
state-
wondering what like investment necessarily means.
Okay,
Like,
yeah. Okay, so let's say we have a $5 million fund balance. I invested with the Island County Treasurer. And you think about if you have money in the bank and you have a savings account, they're going to give you a certain amount of interest on that, say 5% interest. So it's at whatever interest rate is times the amount of money we have times the amount of time it's in the investment will generate revenue for us. So right now we're generating about $10,000 a month in interest income across the district in all of our different funds.
But you can't just invest it like an individual.
No,
You can
and it's not
only
the stock
invest it
market,
in
and
a
it's
very
very
conservative way.
risk. Yeah.
okay, that's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm not out there putting money on slots in the casino or anything with it. We are required by state law to only invest in the Island County Treasurer or in the state of Washington in their investment pools, which are very conservative pools. Oh, yeah. Can't do Fidelity or anything else. So then we get to the state revenue, and it's broken in two parts. It's apportionment and then it's a categorical. And these are all based upon two things, basically. Number of kids we have, and then some of them are based on free and reduced population percentages. They tie into some of the calculations. But you'll see that, you know, we're looking at the basic education apportionment going up slightly. There's some things in the formula that modified those staffing formulas a little bit to increase. Special education, again, had a modifier in there that increased a little bit. And then the others are going to be very similar. The only real differences is, you know, if they're tied, like LAP is remediation funds, and it's based on last year's student population and then a free and reduced change. So if that goes up a little bit, you get a little more. If it goes down, you get a little less, that type of thing. The only one I want to point out is the transportation reimbursement. That's the money we receive for operating our yellow school buses. And you see that I'm expecting it to go down. It went down this year. And that's a direct result of changing from a two-stage bus run to a single bus run. The way they do it is we have 3 counts a year. And they use a count from the previous spring and then 2 from the current year to come up with your dollar amount. That's why you can see that in 23, 24, even though we have a single bus run this year, they used part of last year where we had a double bus run. So it bumped it up a little more. So moving into 24, 25, we're going to have single bus runs in all 3 counts and probably fewer kids on buses because that's part of the calculations, number of kids and number of miles they drive and all those things. So I'm expecting it will be a little less than it is today. So it kind of gives you an idea that we went down about 90,000. I think we'll go down, you know, maybe another 80,000 or something. So just that expectation that there's not as much funding. So when you talk about transportation, if it's costing you $1.2 million a year and we're getting 750,000, we're picking that up because it's a service we need, right? You know, we need to get kids to school. Like food service, we need to feed people. Federal revenue. This is one, if you look at 21, 22 and 22, 23, you can see it was much higher. Those are the ESSER days when we're getting all those federal funds. So, you know, when you hear people talk about the ESSER cliff, well, the ESSER cliff happened last year. We're past that. We're back to what I would consider normal, about $1.2 million in federal funds. Also, the numbers for 24, 25 are very round estimates because these numbers don't come out till a lot later in the spring. So I won't get actual numbers until we get closer to July in those, but they're traditionally very similar to what we had the previous year. The one thing I did put money in there is for safety net. We have a need to apply for that based on services we're providing currently, which will increase our expenditures. So hopefully we can for some of that. So I'm looking at that as a potential additional income for that. And you also see with the federal school lunch program that it increases by about the difference between the elementary free lunch and paid lunch to free and reduced. My hope, though, is that if we do have free meals for all kids, that the participation level will go up. If we look at 21-22 and 22-23, when meals were free, you can see that we substantially had more meals at that time. So hopefully it will help. I'm not counting on it in the revenue format, but hopefully it will help offset that a little bit.
This is another one of those make the conservative estimate for the budget and over deliver situations, hopefully.
Yeah, because hopefully if anything you can do that generates more revenue than you expected helps offset that budget deficit, which we will talk about.
Well, I can tell you anecdotally, my daughter will be having more school lunches next year.
Yeah. So this is just a summary of where I think our estimated revenue is going to be. So if you add those all together, about 21 point, almost $4 million. So it's up about, $300,000 or so from the previous year. But the other side of that is the change in expenditures. And I'll give you we're just starting this process. So what I've done is I've taken all contracts we have today and I've increased them by things I do know. I do know they all go up by IPD at least. I do know that certificated staff have a negotiated agreement already in place, so it increases them by a certain dollar amount. I know that the cost of health insurance is going up to $11.78 per month. So I calculate all those things based on that. So, before I do that, historical revenue, this is something I find fascinating. So you can see that, those are the yesterdays where our federal dollars were a lot larger. But when we started adding these and looking at these, I wanted to point out that we're looking at $21,393,597 next year for our budget. If we go back to 2019-20, 5 years ago, it was almost identical. So other than that bump in there for ESSER, our revenue hasn't really changed in 5 years with all the inflationary factors that have happened since that time. And that's the struggle of why we have to still continue to refine our budget and, live within our means, because our means is not growing. That's the biggest issue. The hope is, one more year, we get away from the final reduction in expenditures, and then we at least get IPD across the board, which would be helpful. So just one of those things, it's just a very obvious fact that, if you don't have revenue increasing for 5 years with, 15% inflation during that time, you're going to have some type of a situation you have to deal with. So here's kind of where we are today as I wrap this up. If we're looking at $21.4 million, based on the expenditures that I anticipate, and this is moving up salaries, increasing them by whatever the negotiated agreement is, healthcare, the fact that our insurance is going up and, utilities rise by 3% a year, and we have needs for specific students that'll increase costs. I'm thinking that, it's going up by about $1.4 million, which would be a fund balance change about $1.3 million. We could do that. With $4.9 million, we could not make any changes to the budget for the coming year and end up with $3.6 million. I would highly not recommend that, because what it does is it creates a huge hole for the following year that you would have to cut 12% of the budget in order to get there. My recommendation is you look at about a 5% budget reduction as a goal for this year. You may not get to the full $1.3 million and use some fund balance, which is what we've been doing for the last few years, is we've been getting to a certain level and then using a few $100,000 of fund balance, knowing that that fund balance will come down over time. But if you have a $1.3 million shortfall this year and you add whatever next year is on top of that, you're going to need a $2.5 million reduction to have your ending fund balance that you need. And it'd be catastrophic. So my recommendation would be, looking at about $1 million reduction, or about 5%, somewhere in that range at this point for this particular year.
And we've seen from other local districts what happens when you don't keep up with that you have to make the extreme changes all in one year. And we've seen that it means borrowing money from other funds and repaying it and borrowing from other sources, not healthy, as you said.
Yeah, that will not be our recommendation. Our recommendation at the next meeting is one that we've made to the board every year since I've been in the district, which is allowing us to make the necessary reductions. So you'll see that resolution at the next meeting. We also are required by contract, not by statute, but by contract, to notify certificated staff by April 15th of the potential for reduction. So staff will be notified on Monday. I did notify the SWIA leadership that we were anticipating something we've done again for many, many years, unfortunately. We also anticipate some folks will be retiring, but we know we won't get it all by attrition. So that's the process that we're just beginning as an administrative staff, is to what's the enrollment look like? What do the classes look like at the different levels? What's the class size? Again, going through it with a fine-tooth comb. But you'll hear more about that as we go on. But at the next meeting, expect that resolution. Expect that on April 15th, staff are notified, and then May 15th, for sure, our certificated staff are notified as to whether or not they have a position next year. And as Dan said, once we get to that June 1st date, or basically May 15th, if we say to somebody, you have a job, they have a job, they have a contract. So we, again, are conservative. Doesn't mean that we won't add at some point if we know we have more students, but we always work to be conservative. And it's difficult, but it certainly has allowed our district to remain in good financial standing.
And it's a little bit of an unfortunate situation that is shared by many other districts, where that initial April list is larger than the people who will actually be affected. And so that adds some stress to them, but some relaxation of stress for others who are not on that list. And again, that's not a thing unique to this district. That is, many other districts, if not all of them across the state, have those same timelines. It's just an unfortunate part of providing security to some folks while adding stress to some others.
And, we realize that, this is difficult. It's a difficult process. We're talking about people, we're talking about lives, we're talking about kids. But there's no alternative to doing this. We cannot be a district that ends up in binding conditions because, we didn't do our jobs, which is what I was hired and you were elected to do. But I understand, the need for compassion in this process, and that it's really difficult, especially with all the needs we have of kids these days. The needs seem to be growing, not getting, better. And so it's a difficult process, but hopefully, we can do a lot of forethought and a lot of, compassion, I guess.
I just wanted to acknowledge how hard everyone's working. You in your role with budgeting and making these recommendations and difficult decisions, and of course, everybody that's, serving the children directly, serving the students and the young adults directly. And any decision that involves somebody losing their job is a painful one. But when it's somebody who is so vital in the life of a young person, it's a tough topic, and I appreciate the compassion.
I had one thought that came up. I expect that you're already ahead of me on this, and I just thought of it now, so I didn't get a chance to check with you before. Although this is actually going to be more of a question for Paul, Mr. Field, sorry. Would it be possible to get split reporting as we go forward starting next year on for capital projects, splitting it between bond and levy funds, so we know how much of that local money is still continuing to be spent on ongoing projects versus the large bond funds?
Yes.
I figured that's something y'all had already been talking about, but I just wanted to make sure it was top of mind. I was 99.5% certain that the professionals had already thought of that, but I wanted to mention it anyhow. Yeah. Thank you. Anything else? Anything from the community? We don't have anything from those who are on Zoom now. Okay.
I have a question about forecasting. So at this point last year in the process, you were creating 23, 24 forecasts. And how have those forecasts compared to actuals? And how have you taken that to learn to create more accurate forecasts for 24, 25, if at all?
So if we look at enrollment, we're almost exactly where we thought we'd be. We're, I don't know, 1 FTE off. The changes is we thought that our fund balance was going to be slightly lower than it ended up. But, we're trying to do that 5 months before the end of the school year and a lot of things happened. So that changed a little bit. But the biggest change was that we received additional funding that we normally wouldn't have received. So there was additional transportation safety net funding we received. There was some changes to the funding formula in this legislative session that rather than becoming active in 24-25, is going to be retroactive to 23-24 in July. So there's additional funding coming in from that. So we basically have about 300,000 more in funding than we anticipated, which dropped that, $500,000 fund balance used to about 200,000. So I think we're really close, except for the things that we didn't know about that happened retroactively during this legislative session.
And the things that happen because we have students with needs.
Mhm.
So we have a student whose needs are so significant that we had to file for safety net. We've hired additional instructional staff by way of paras this year, for the most part. So there are, and TK, but we did have the students come in to offset the cost of that. So again, as the school year goes on, there are unanticipated expenses, but with the appropriate fund balance, we've been able to manage it, which is why keeping a 1/12 fund balance is so important, because at least you have the room when the students that come to your door need more than you were preparing to offer.
And especially since so many of the federal programs in particular are repayment programs. Yeah.
Right. And you should need it for cash flow. There are months that we receive less than what our, $1.8 million expenditure is going to be. Matter of fact, there are more months where our revenue is less than our funding than the other way around.
Can you elaborate on what safety net means in this context?
Sure. So for students with special needs, they have an individualized educational plan. And what you basically have are students whose needs are so extraordinary that they cost considerably more than the typical allocation for a student with special needs. We had one student in that situation, and I don't want to elaborate because I don't want to identify the individual, but required such a high level of intense support service that it cost us probably, if it were over the whole year, it would have been about $260,000. But because it happened part year, it wasn't. So the safety net is for part year. But we've anticipated that service level will continue next year. So the safety net, it doesn't match 1-to-1, but it's additional funding because it's such a significant need.
There's
That's-
a threshold for it. It's usually around $34,000. So it's any student whose educational placement costs more than that. You can apply for the difference, but it's not a guaranteed result. It's a pretty intensive application. And you submit it in March and then find out in May, June-ish, whether or not
Thank you.
you've received
And
it.
they did, thankfully, Andrea, and with your experience, if you missed a dotting an I or crossing a T, you would lose funding. But the legislature actually did act this year to make it, if it's not a substantive error, that you're more likely to get the funding.
Yeah.
So,
Very good. Thank you.
It used to literally be, I remember we submitted one in Everett, and in the present levels, we said on the goals, we said opportunities, and then in the goal, we wrote trials. And a $200,000 IEP got thrown out over that with no funding. So it's intense. It's less
Oh.
intense now.
Yet another flaw in our system. Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much,
Yeah,
Mr. Bowman.
thank you.
I would say we're looking forward to seeing how this progresses, but well, it's still the budget. It will be of intense interest to see how this progresses. We'll move on to policy review, and I'll hand it over to Director Downs to take us through this.
So we have just a couple policies that are more lighter in changes. I believe Director Williford, you just found some slight language that needed to be adjusted around hims, hers, switching those to theirs, and that would be the administration in the absent policy or decree.
Yes, 4 of the 5 on our list here tonight are, I believe, will be minor changes, but are certainly open if there are additional questions or if there's something that the administration has identified as should be updated. So the first one is policy 13.
Possible to read on the screen.
Yeah, is there a way to just zoom in on that or?
I guess you can, yeah.
There you go.
So policy 1330, the administration in absence of policy or procedure, basically, and Director Downs, please correct me if I err in any of these descriptions, just gives Dr. Moshe and the rest of our staff, in particular the administrators, the right to do things if they aren't explicitly prohibited by policy if they need to. And if it's going to be a major change, that other staff would inform Dr. Moshe. If it's something that Dr. Moshe believes needs to be brought up to the board's attention, she has a responsibility to do so as soon as possible. And so for this one, there's just 2 changes that I'm suggesting, and they're both in the last sentence. There's a she shall immediately consult, that should be a they, and I'd like to make it board chair / president to fit with our other policies. These changes may seem minor in general, but it's part of our intent to touch all of these policies over about 6 years or so, just to make sure that things keep getting updated and that we don't miss any changes that need to happen.
And the last time it was reviewed was 05, so it's timely to do it. But the impact hasn't changed.
Right.
This might be an unnecessary level of specificity, but is there any reason to indicate whether the board president or the superintendent has the authority to call the special board meeting if they are in disagreement about its advisability? I would assume the board president would have that authority, but should that be explicated?
That's how I read this, actually, that the superintendent has the responsibility to inform the board chair, who then they consult with the board chair on the advisability. But
By board policy, the superintendent or the members of the board can call a
Sure.
special meeting.
So there's no need to refer to that policy here because it's implied.
Yeah.
Thank you.
and I would also turn it over to the administration to see if there's any changes that you see as necessary in these. And you'll hear me ask that for each of these minor change ones. Okay. And I am tracking changes in a document that I will get to Ms. Maccaro later. So that is the first one. Anything from the public, members of the public who are here?
I have a stylistic question.
Yes.
Is my recollection correct that we're trying to change all the shalls to wills to try to have a more like modern vernacular, or am I totally making that up? Okay, maybe that's what I'm thinking of. I just want consistency
Yeah.
more than anything else. I have no dog in the fight.
We actually, the director that you stepped in after was the one who wanted to change them all to shalls. So it's fitting that you would like to change them all back to wills.
I will say, though, that I will go to the mat when it comes down to shoulds versus shalls, because that is a real clear substantive difference.
That-
You know, y'all do what you want to do on those.
I agree that that's you should do this rather than you must. Yeah. Okay, so that's all for that one. Just the two changes there. The next one is policy 2151 on interscholastic activities. This has a few more that I've got noted. I haven't made all of the changes in this yet. I've got handwritten notes on it so far. One question I have for Dr. Moshe is, should this be superintendent or designee throughout, or just superintendent? And that's for the board as well.
I would leave it superintendent.
The only reason I was curious is if that's something that you would want an athletic director looking at, or if you want it coming through you. And I would leave that decision to the professionals.
By the time it comes up, it won't be me, but it
Yes.
should stay with the superintendent.
Okay.
Yep.
So in this one, we have in point D, there's a he, she, is, that should be a they, are. In point G, there's a parent that should be parent/guardian. That's in the middle. In point H, there's two parent guardians. There's a they, he, she.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but also in C, line 2, there's a he, she.
Oh, good catch. Thank you.
John. Okay.
Yeah, this is another one where I'm curious if there are any, they wish.
Still accurate. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Our coaches, staff members, even, we don't give out any non-prescribed medication, aspirin, ibuprofen, et cetera.
There is a his or her in that paragraph as well.
In G,
J.
J, yes.
It might be worth just doing a find and replace for his, her, and
I've got a
he,
list
she.
here.
Yeah,
That
there
that'll
are
definitely, yes.
instances that might come up with a computerized search too.
Yes. I did have a question on the last paragraph. There's a list of superintendent shall prepare rules for the conduct of student activities, including but not limited to. Most of these seem perfectly reasonable. Physical appearance, I'd kind of like to pull that out because I don't know that we need,
The dress code, even though it's, we still have a dress
Yeah,
code.
th-
We
this
still
is
have
true.
an expectation of, what's the term, John? When they're at a game, they have to,
You're representing the school, the district.
right.
Could that be
team.
changed to physical attire instead of physical appearance? Because I
That's a
feel
good
like
answer.
Yes.
Like that.
appearance
thank you.
refers to like
I
body
also
image.
suggest curfew could be stricken from that. I don't think we have,
There are still some overnight trips.
oh, correct.
Yeah.
When we're on the road, yes.
Okay, so physical attire, that's good. Yeah, leave the curfew.
I feel like it's important to allow students to like be able to express themselves in sports because I know at a lot of our cross country meets, like the girls team always would do trans lives matter. I forgot what the exact saying. Because of the transphobia experience on the other teams.
Mhm.
I wouldn't want that kind of thing to be prohibited by a new policy change.
I agree entirely. As long as it's within the dress code, I think that we should be empowering our student athletes.
Yeah,
to
I'm
express
thinking more
themselves.
about it, just if there's a situation where a student, for example, is wearing drug paraphernalia on their shirt, you want to be able to say no.
Would,
Yeah, you might just say, You might just say attire and leave out physical attire, because I can't think of a kind of attire that's not physical that would be within our
Mhm.
purview.
Would an athletic or activity event have a different dress code than the standard for the academic day dress code?
I know that some coaches in other districts, I don't know if this is the practice here, require, for instance, ties for football players on away games.
Well, it could also imply uniform. Like if
Mhm.
you're not in an appropriate uniform,
I
you
read it as
yeah.
the uniform that you wear.
Yeah, that's
So,
a really
like,
good point.
For tennis, we have a uniform shirt, but then we don't really have a specific uniform for the rest. So just like wearing the uniform, even if you're the one
Yeah.
responsible for it.
That's a good point.
I also wonder if there's an alternative term to unsportsmanlike. Unsportspersonlike is cumbersome, but is there a way to have a gender neutral reference to appropriate conduct?
I think they still use sportsmanship, like fishermen.
I'm just
No,
thinking
I know
about,
the WIA still uses that term.
okay.
Conduct becoming of student athletes.
That's
I
a
mean,
lot of words.
It is.
Conduct
I'm
unbecoming.
not attached to the idea of changing it. I just want to look for gendered language wherever we
Yeah.
can reduce it.
I really appreciate that notation. I would be concerned about finding a term that is as recognizable.
Fair enough.
I have a question about that sentence that appears after the line break after G. Is that part of G, or is that its own thing that needs like a H and then H would become I, etc.? It seems weird that's just kind of floating there.
That, I think that would be part of G, yes.
So I would like us to strike that line break because it creates confusion.
I have no problem with that. It makes a giant paragraph, but many of these are giant paragraphs.
Yeah, well, as it is now, it's in no man's land, so no person's land.
Yes.
Thank you.
Between the lines. Okay.
I have a question about this broadly. There's a lot in here.
Mhm.
And so you don't have to go line by line, but how is this typically enforced?
Well, first, this really follows under the WI guidelines, almost verbatim. And, you know, for example, we don't hold workshops for our coaches as a school or as a district because they have to go through WI training. And it's a program called Final Forms, and it's concussion protocol, the rules of specific sports, first aid, CPR. So our coaches do go through that every season, before every season.
And Paul presents to the board every year as the superintendent's designee on interscholastic activities. So that is something that's part of this.
Yeah, and you talk about equipment maintained. You know, something that we review every year is all of our middle school and high school, especially the football gear, shoulder pads, and helmets. They have to have certification, and so we have to change helmets out yearly.
Thank you. That's probably the most common sports related feedback I hear from students. My helmet's 20 years old. And I always say, it might be that old, but I know it gets checked every year. So despite its age, it's safe.
I'd like to make sure we're also looking at beyond sports in this, because I know that WIA and interscholastic includes those. I note that J specifically calls out interscholastic athletic activities for medical insurance, which I think is perfectly fine. I, for instance, I think actually should have that athletic there also, because I don't know if you need to furnish evidence of physical fitness prior to becoming a
What that is
UN or
actually
something.
what's required is every student has to have a physical, updated physical. So I think that's, to me, the same.
Okay.
But would that apply to a student participating in band or a speech and debate program
No.
or something?
No.
And that's why I'm
It'd be
suggesting
an athletic, not
in there.
activity.
Could we be specific where the requirements are limited to athletic activities?
But A is all interscholastic activities and events in compliance with WIAA. right? So,
But does WAAA oversee non-athletic?
yes.
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 So when one of these references a requirement that is limited only to student athletes, can that be specified?
That's where I was going, because it is in J, and I think it should be in I as well.
Is this one of those things that we're like able to change? Because I know we get a lot of our policy from like OSPI and WASDA, and like we're not really allowed to edit those things other than minor like for our schools, like adjusting the gendered pronouns. But like, is this one of those things that is in our realm really for large edits?
That's a very good question.
We can edit any of the policies. We're not tied to. The question is are our edits legal? So when we start from what's with WASDA, we know that that is legal. And then we can make pretty substantive changes. And oftentimes if we're starting to make substantive changes, then we'll run it through legal to make sure it's still legal. So.
It's interesting that this policy says that we're going to do everything in compliance with WIAA, and yet the board annually has to say that it's going to join WIAA.
Well, as we learned in the last meeting, there isn't really an alternative.
No, you can't play anybody else without it. So,
Okay, so I'll go through and update all the his, hers, and parents offline. I don't think we need to call out each and every one. I'll do a find replace as you suggested and go through there. So are there any other notes from the administration on how this affects students? Any notes, notes from the students on how this affects them? Anything from the community? Okay, I'll turn it back over to Director Downs for
Okay.
policy 4010.
And I think that that one is the staff communications one. So I brought this one forward because we have a board goal centered around communication. This policy hasn't been really looked at since 2007. It's incredibly brief. And I think just as we've had so much conversation district-wide around communication with our community, communication with parents, communication with students, I think it's an opportunity for us to really capture some of that culture that we've been trying to create and change within the district. I do want to preface that with you can't really change culture through policy. Policy typically reflects the changes of culture. So there's also places where there's procedure and then there is policy. So in this, I would love to get people's thoughts about what we could expand this out to. I don't think that this is a one and done shift and change. I think it's, drafting and bringing a draft back. But I think that it's an opportunity to take a look at it. And I also wanted to just kind of share, as I've been pondering the feedback that we've gotten from the community about communication. I think that there is a larger need where we have been staying very, very high level, thinking about it as the board is not communicating. And I think that it goes larger. I think it goes down to a grassroots level about how are teachers communicating with parents, how are paras communicating with parents, and what does that look like? What are our expectations for that? And thinking about it beyond just what is kind of blasted out. John, Mr. Patton oftentimes talks about teachers knowing every kid by name, strength, and need. How do we as a district demonstrate that at all levels so that board members are able to demonstrate that? How do teachers demonstrate that? How do the front office people demonstrate that? And so I think it's an opportunity for us to capture what we would like to see, and then build a policy that supports that. Also with a caveat of when you put expectations into policy, it has to work with the CBA agreements. It has to so we can't just be like, everybody will call every parent in the district at least once a week. Like, that's not what we would hope for this policy to go to, but more so, what are
So-
we looking for?
I was actually thinking this policy was superseded by 0002.
Which is interesting because Director Greenhairn wanted to write another policy to go after 003 that or 002 that was similar to like this. But I think that 002 outlines what happens when it goes wrong, or how are we communicating with each other. I see this differently in that I think it has an opportunity to talk about like, how do we as a district communicate out versus that interpersonal or in a meeting kind of conversation.
I saw this as an opportunity to bring some of what we had learned in 002 to expand on this personally, which is sort of somewhere in between the two. I agree that they address different things, that 0002 addresses what happens, sets the stage for when you are communicating, when you are in communication with someone, and what happens when that breaks down. And I think this one talks more about what the district expects everyone within the district to be doing in order to facilitate those conversations.
I almost wonder if it might be modeled after 0002, where 0002 is professional communication standards, and the other, whether it's 003 or something different, is like district representation standards around how one reflects the goals, priorities, mission, vision of the district outward in all of one's dealings when one is a representative of the district in any capacity, whether board, staff, administrator.
I sort of see 0002 as covering a lot of that when you're in the discussion, how we represent ourselves, how we represent the district, because it's the expectation that we'll have those professional standards when we're
Right.
communicating.
I do think there's something about making one's best effort to accurately represent the mission, vision, values, goals, policies, and priorities of the district in one's dealings with constituents, the public, students, families, staff, that I think is absent potentially by design, because this was sort of a what to do when things break down policy, or how to behave when under duress kind of policy. And I see the potential for there to be a policy around how do we represent the district and its work on a good day? What do we aspire to as we communicate about what we're here to do, what we're achieving in our buildings? And maybe it's a missing part of 0002 that could be added with some additional work.
Well, I'm seeing a little bit of that in 4010, 4010, in that first sentence. And I think it could be reinforced to support what you're suggesting. But it does talk about communicating and interpreting mission policies, goals, program. But I think that it could certainly be reinforced to really emphasize the point that you're talking about.
I think like a piece of feedback that I get pretty consistently from community members is they will oftentimes say, I don't ever hear from my student's teacher. Like, I don't hear from them. Now, we also know that there's, weekly newsletters going out, and there are social media posts, right? Like there is definitely an effort on behalf of the staff to communicate. But I think what potentially could be missing from the community is that really intimate connection of, my kid, not my kid is in your class and I know what's happening, but my kid. And I think that this is a place where we can capture some of that, not in a directive way. Like, again, I don't want it to be like teachers, you're going to spend all of your lift time calling parents and telling them, what their kid did that week. But I want it to be more around, we've set some really intensive goals as a board around communication and how we are seeking out input from the community, what kind of development we're engaging in to, try and stay ahead of that. And I think it's an opportunity for us to take that out of a board level and look at what does it really mean on a district level.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I feel like it's definitely it's like a cultural thing too. Like you want to make it in a way where it's like not the policy saying, oh, call the teachers or email them, because that's just like putting an extra load on the teachers and it's not actually doing anything. But I feel like it's kind of in a way where we want to do it like parent teacher conferences, right? Where that like we want to create a culture that like encourages that kind of thing. And like I know my sister had like an art show down there. This was like a couple years ago, but that kind of thing too, where it's like parents can feel involved with their kids' education. That's like it's helpful, but it's not always just like a policy driven thing. It's just the policy leaving open room for that stuff.
I think I see some confusion that I think, well, here, I'll just say this. So 0002 was more about like how we communicate with each other, what our standards are for how we hold ourselves accountable. And it also applied to everybody, board, staff, community, parents and guardians, etc. 4010, based on its name, is not only limited to staff, but it also sort of confuses the how, which is now in 0002, and a tiny bit of what. So what should be communicated? And so I think we have an opportunity to sort of divide the how, which is now very well covered in 0002. So clauses such as to be courteous and considerate, that could be replaced by, refer to 0002 and make a clearer boundary between the how in 0002 and what the board expects staff to communicate to any of the relevant constituent groups.
I really appreciate that distinction. Thank you. I guess I just have a minor hesitation around anything that feels as though we are prescribing additional work for staff that are already stretched very thin. And I wonder if some of what is desired could be achieved through a variety of means outside policymaking, like community education opportunities, communications from the district to parents about ways to be involved in day-to-day classroom news and updates. I know my experience as a parent in our district varies according to my energy and commitment, how much I'm willing to be proactive about communication. Not to say that it's all my responsibility as a parent, but I carry some of the opportunity to increase communication. So I guess I just wonder if there's something in addition to policy that can support that cultural shift.
And again, my intention is not to say that we need a policy that prescribes here's how you will communicate with parents, right? Like that's not the intention at all. What I think I'm trying to convey at 8 o'clock after a very long day for all of us is that what I consistently hear from the community is that we don't communicate. And I think that we as a board have internalized that as we, the 7 of us, don't communicate. And I don't think that that's what the community is trying to say. And I think that they continue to say, you're not listening, you're not listening. I think what it comes down to with the more conversations that I have is that how we are blasting out. So how we are saying in a social media post, here's how to connect in with your school, is not meeting the need of the people saying you're not communicating. And so I think there's an opportunity with this to not say like, here's the list of things you're going to do to check the box that you communicated, but more so to capture all the work that we've been doing so that things like Susie's Coffee with the Principals are reflected somewhere in a policy without saying you have to have a coffee with the principal. But that it leaves that door open for a new principal who I hear we might have to be looking for in the next few years, to come in and be like, oh, like this is what I can do in terms of that communication. Or when we replace our superintendent next year, because Joe is going to go off into the sunset, we don't have to have that person come back through and have all of that learning from the community that we've had to go through. So I just think it's an opportunity to capture all of the community listening sessions that we have done, all the work with Jay Marie, all of those things that we have done and learned from without, like, again, without it saying you shall do X, Y, and Z, or you should do X, Y, and Z.
I'd like to suggest another lever that we have available to us that might be more appropriate for getting to those goals, which is district goals, superintendent goals. Writing something down in policy tends to end up being prescriptive. It lends itself towards shalls. A goal is a work towards this. It's something that isn't prescriptive and allows the professionals to use their best judgment in how to achieve something. It feels like trying to achieve that connectivity would make a very valuable goal for the
I don't
superintendent.
disagree with you. But goals change as boards change, goals change as superintendents change. Goals also don't have so that's why I started by saying the policy can reflect the culture. And I'm getting a little spicy about this one because I remember when 0002 came up and I said, we should have a policy about that because it's going to get crazy. And then we didn't do it and then it got crazy. But like, I think there's an opportunity for us to capture the work that we have done to set the bar, especially as we go through so much district change, that these are our expectations. And it doesn't mean that a board in the future won't change it. It doesn't mean a superintendent in the future won't change it, but it sets the tone.
What would you suggest it look like?
I don't know just yet. I wanted to get people's ideas, but I think, like, for example, one of our board goals, Joe, I know you know it in your head. What's the board goal for
think-
communication?
You have a very high expectation of what I
Oh,
can remember.
We just had a phone conversation.
So I know that goal. So the one that's fresh in my head is goal number 5,
Yes.
because
that
goal
one.
number 5 says something like the board will change a policy to enshrine these things that we've been talking about in all the other communication.
It was not, it
improvement
was,
goals.
it was either to develop or add and modify policy to
Yeah.
change the communication work that we have done.
Yeah.
So I think that rather than writing a new one to meet our board goal, which is where Joe called me, I think this is the one that I think it would make sense to adjust it to. Now, what it looks like at the end of that, Dr. Moshe, I don't know just yet. But I like pieces that I've heard come out is splitting the how to leave in 002, which I think is where we leave it. And then the what becomes the 410. So that's when we look at what does communication look like and how does that flow throughout the year? How does that flow throughout levels? So we could look at, for example, here's the level of communication you could expect from somebody at X, Y, and Z roles. So in ways that still protect people's workloads. For example, sometimes, and I don't know this, whether the South Whitby prescribes this, but I've been in many districts where paraeducators who are students one-to-ones are not the person communicating with the parent because it puts the paraeducator in a position where they're acting outside of their job description. Well, if your only interaction with a staff member in the district is that one-on-one paraeducator and they consistently say, I can't talk to you about that, you have to talk to somebody else, a policy that captures that is actually then not only empowering for the staff member, but it's also clarifying for the parent. And so it could look like, here's what teachers are able to communicate or where their job descriptions lie. And here's methods and ways that they are expected to communicate. So for example, defining it as school district email or the application so that, and here's the work hours you can expect to hear from them by, so that if you have a parent who's emailing a teacher, oh, I don't know, like I did at like 9:07 at night the other night, because that's when I get to do that. There's a policy that states like you shouldn't expect a response until 8 a.m. the next day or 8 a.m. within 72 hours or whichever. I think there's also districts that will put response times within that. So like expectations that, you know, you hear back from someone within 48 hours is a typical one that comes in. But I think it's an opportunity to expand it out beyond the, 7-ish sentences that this policy has.
Hearing you say that, I'd love to see not just the what, but the why in the policy. Like why it's important that you don't talk to the paraeducator who is your one-on-one. So something about in order to protect relationships, because I think that the why is important for people who want to know why they can't talk to that person.
Yeah. And I think it also helps reinforce, Brooke, when you respond and say, have you gone to the nearest level? Like, have you gone to X, Y, and Z? This helps reinforce that, which I know we have in policy in other places, but it continues to reinforce that communication and that work.
I see a lot of similarities between some of what we're discussing now and when we went to change the discipline policy in two major ways. One is what I hear from you is that we're trying to capture some of the current best practices and some of the things that the district and our staff are already doing well, as opposed to creating additional workload for them. That's the first similarity. The second is this is right on the border between the board's lane and the administration of the work of education. And just very frankly, I feel like I learned a lot on policymaking through the mistakes I made in the discipline, my initial approach to changes to discipline policy, and then working with the building leaders and bless you, and Dr. Moshe, I feel like we as a board came to a really great final change to the discipline policy that stayed within our lane and held the district accountable to implementing discipline in the ways that we know are best practices. And so I think we can do something similar for this as long as we as a board work really closely with the leaders who are going to need to implement these changes.
I
feel
just
like-
wondered if you, oh, sorry. I just wondered if you two might enjoy connecting offline to do a bit of drafting after this meeting. I'm volunteering you that you'd be good at it.
Yes, and going back to discipline policy, I think it would need to be in lockstep with Dr. Moshe, just so that we don't get too far in the weeds and then have to pull it back.
I think you all are envisioning like an 8-page policy, and I promise it's going to be like 3 paragraphs, just more than 7 sentences.
I was just saying, I don't view parents reading policy very often. So I do worry sometimes, like if we have something that's meant to be clarifying for a parent and also being clarifying for a teacher, it's just going to be for the teacher and the parents aren't going to end up really seeing much of it. And that's my only thing that I had that.
I agree with you completely. I do think it's useful for a staff member to be able to refer back to policy when a parent has a question. And since we have staff members here, you can confirm or deny that.
I do sometimes, or I'll reach out to our union reps to have conversation when a parent calls a teacher in the middle of the day where their child is in the classroom expecting a phone conversation. So I think we need to delicately look the first word I look at is share the responsibility. So when we talk about it in this context, I get defensive towards staff who I know effectively communicate, and I go through and I see their weekly updates and I see communications. So I want to be really sensitive to the fact that we have teachers that really do a great job. You probably hear from a minority of people who say, I don't hear from so-and-so enough, where the majority hopefully do and are. I live with my husband, has turned off Parent Square because it's too much information. So he relies on me. So we live in this information age where is it truly the balance of a reciprocal approach to seeking information versus expecting it to show up? And then when it's too much, you just can't handle it. So I think taking a balanced approach to the ledge, and a lot of times, a lot of emails I'll respond with, have you talked to your student? Because we're teaching them how to talk about their assignments and their grades. So I think we need to loop in that component to this too, and maybe just really delicately look at this. I mean, 2007, we probably weren't emailing as frequently as we do today. Is it healthy as much as we email today? I don't know. So it's that balance of what's best for student.
Yeah,
What's- I'm sorry. What's interesting to me is my whole read on this policy is about all of us pulling together and being able to talk about the vision, mission, and goals of the district, and basically not badmouth the district as a staff member. That's the way I looked at this, that this gives the credence for us to say, not censor anyone, not deny a whistleblower, but basically it's your obligation as a member of this school community to support the values, vision, and mission of the district. That's how I read this policy, which is why my whole mindset on what you're talking about was in a very different place.
And I think that still should be present in it. And I think it's building out the how. How do we do that? How do and how?
Well, then you go to Joe's point, and the how is really not the board's
True.
purview. The
True.
board's purview is, what is it that you want done? And then the how is the procedure around it or the administrative responsibility. So again, I'm just putting it in perspective. It's the board's decision as to how much you want to work on this and
Right.
prescribe what's done.
Dr. Moshe, your impression and mine were the same in the sense that I immediately read it as kind of a, like a branding tool. Like we want everybody in the system to be able to speak to what we do and how we do it and what we value and what we're guiding, what is our guiding star. And that's why I wanted to refer to it as a district representation policy. And I do think that it's, like I work in the nonprofit sector. And so in every nonprofit I've worked with, I've had roles that closely track to communications or outreach. And there's been an expectation that every single employee, whether they are an executive director or a part-time program assistant or a house cleaner, that they can either say the mission statement or give an elevator speech about what we do. And I think that expectation allows for there to be some values alignment and shared direction within a team. So I hope that that stays in this policy as it's rewritten.
I think going back to what Carter said about whether or not parents read policy, I think a policy like this would be very useful if it could serve multiple purposes, where if a parent has unreasonable expectations of the level of communication that they can have with their teacher, the teacher or the administrator is able to point to something and say, "Yeah, here are the expectations you should have for your classroom teacher." And if there's a staff member who is not meeting those expectations, which should not be new expectations, it should just clarify the existing ones, then a building leader can point to the same policy and show a staff member what the expectations are.
Or a parent or guardian could point to it and say to a building leader, your staff member isn't doing this.
Yeah, that too.
I want to make sure that it's empowering for all sides of that.
I think, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to say it differently, because I think what I think what's coming out is that it's that teachers aren't communicating or whichever. It's not. The conversation we have been having for, I think it's been like 5 years now. It's the way we are communicating is not meeting the community's need. So like we are throwing communication out. Community is throwing communication out, but it's not connecting. And that is the part that I'm trying to capture is there's like, I agree with you, Kayla. The parent square blows my phone up all day long, right? There's tons of communication out. But I can also see people's perspective that that does not show a parent or a guardian that you know their student. And it's not necessarily about when things are going wrong. It's also about when things are going right. How many of our students who do really well in school get no, like, there's never the phone call, there's never the email because everything's going right. And so it's not like what I'm trying to capture in here, which is why like I think it does fit with the mission and vision is it's not so much about like you're doing something wrong, but it's like, let's capture all of the culture work we've been doing over the last 5 years and see if we can start to map out that gray terrain where the communication is missing and see if we can start really diving into that. And you know, Dr. Moshe, you're correct. It might not be policy. It might be more in procedure, but I don't want to lose the last 6 years of work that we've put into it when
And-
things shift and change.
Would you say that you continue to hear that people don't feel we are communicating
Mhm.
successfully?
At all levels, and parents who don't know each other. And you all know this, I am the incognito board member. I hide on my farm and I don't talk to people. So if I'm hearing it, then that's the thing.
I feel like as a student, like there's definitely good communication to students. I would even say it's almost like it's a lot of communication that's like almost too much at times. Like I know Skyward, like it's great because you can check your grades at the time, all the time, but then at the same time, it's like I can check my grades all the time, which is kind of something I don't know. Sometimes I just wonder, like, does a parent need to also have the hear about the benefit of something for the student to get the benefit of it? Like, if a student gets accolades for something at school, does the parent need to be aware of those accolades for the student to benefit from that like same thing? Or is that just like an extra looping them in for something? Because I don't know. I feel like it's also just a time of independence in school sometimes that you need to build. It's just like sometimes looping in, I don't know.
Maybe that's an opportunity to put something in here about age appropriate communications, because in kindergarten the parent probably wants to know, and then by 12th grade, you're right, it's probably less necessary for the parent to know every single thing their senior is doing.
I think we're getting below policy level on this discussion.
Good point.
So I've taken some notes to try to encompass the discussion that's been had here, and noted for Mrs. McCarroll that this one is not ready for a vote. So I think that this is a conversation we can build on. Director Downs, do you feel comfortable if we move on to the next policy for tonight?
Yes, I just need to know if everyone's okay with Director Greenherron and I playing with it.
Working with the administration.
Yes. Moment. So the next one is 5231. And this is another one of the ones that we're just trying to catch up in general. So this is length of workday, which to a question that Director Greenherron, would you like to reference your question on this one? I don't want to steal your thunder on that.
You can steal my thunder because I don't remember my question and my computer died.
It was actually a question that I had as well, that making sure that contracts that are signed supersede this policy as necessary. And Dr. Moshe, now that we're in public.
So again, this defines the workday assuming that there's no other definition. Each of the collective bargaining agreements define the workday for that bargaining unit. And that would supersede this because the board also approves the collective bargaining agreement. So by approving that, you are allowing it to supersede the policy that's general.
And this is another one of those questions that were sent via email as warning that they would be asked in person. So we've got, for this one in C, there is a parents/guardians and a parent/guardian. In the third to last paragraph, there's a he/she works, that should be a they work. And in the second to last paragraph, there's a he/she must either take compensating time, that should be a they must. I will do a find to make sure that we catch all he/she's and parents.
There's also an extraneous comma in the final sentence. Scheduled to
yes.
work, comma, will report for work when schools are closed. It's either extra or it needs a second comma somewhere to separate a clause.
Yeah, I think that's extraneous because the subordinate is scheduled to work, but I don't think that needs to be separated by
Yeah,
commas.
if it said custodial maintenance and office staff, comma, if scheduled to work, comma, will report, that would make it work, or we just ditch it.
And then my other question is the same one to administrators. Does this cover your necessities, knowing that contracts supersede it?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. And then we'll move on to the last one, which is policy 6625, private vehicle transportation. This is another one where it's parents and guardians, parent and guardian, they. And I did have one additional question in point A. We have children there, we have students elsewhere, and in that one, should they all be students? Let's see, the children was in the first line, to drive children to school. We have other things to transport the students to school. I feel like students covers all of our necessities, including 18-year-old seniors who are no longer children.
Presumably, if a child is being driven to school, they are a student going to school.
Correct. I would change one word in here, or remove a word. I would, under B, I would say upon explicit approval, not necessarily written, because there have been times when staff have called into the principal to say, so-and-so's on the side of the road and I'd like to pick them up. Do I have your permission? So just as long as it's explicit and not implied, but it can be verbal versus written, maybe followed up in writing, but I want to be able to give that flexibility.
So just explicit approval or explicit verbal or written approval? Yeah.
Explicit approval. That's also inclusive of people who would use nonverbal communication in the event of there being an accessibility need.
And could theoretically cover a thumbs up emoji if that became the case, although I would hope that approval is not given via thumbs up emoji in most cases.
Kill 'em, these balls.
Anything else on this one?
There's reference to a procedure that's not in the policy guide, though perhaps it may be elsewhere. Is that procedure?
We
to be
have
found elsewhere?
procedures for the use of private vehicles, and they're actually on our website under forms for chaperone procedures, volunteer procedures. So they definitely exist
Great.
for
That's
the use of private vehicles.
perfect place for things that parents and guardians would need to exist. Thank you.
Anything else on this one? Okay, I believe that's the last policy. Thank you all very much. Good night. This meeting is adjourned.